19 June 1944, Western Pacific east of the Marianas. A pale sun lifts out of low haze as Task Force 58 steams in a wide arc decks, flexing under the weight of armed F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. In the combat information, center's red grease pencils move across transparent boards. SK Air Search Radar sweeps report first, then SC. Two repeaters on picket destroyers confirm that the distant clutter is not weather. Controllers call ranges in thousands of yards. The duty phrase is flat and unromantic, multiple groups high and fast, bearing 310 Angels. 25. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitchell, commander of the Fast Carrier Task Force, has promised that his fighter direction will break the first wave before it gets within torpedo or dive range. Now the test begins. You are on the island of USS Lexington CV-16, where Lieutenant Commander Bill Coleman, fighter director, stands under harsh lamps in the Combat Information Center. The room is smaller than legend suggests. It smells of pencil, canvas, and coffee. He works through the voice circuit to vector combat air patrol sections from VF-16 and VF-2, folding their plots into the larger picture built by the radar team. Out on the deck minutes earlier, Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu of VF-16 checked his Hellcat magnetos, and Mixture looked once at the sea and launched into a sky already alive with other blue shapes. He knows the doctrine: climb to altitude quickly, stay on controller vectors, roll into disciplined 2-ship and 4-ship sections and kill cleanly. No lone wolf chases, no radio clutter, no wasted fuel. Procedure over romance. Westward Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa and the first mobile fleet push strike groups into the air. The pilots are brave and determined. Many are also new. Veteran losses since 1942, limited training hours because of fuel scarcity and reduced gunnery and formation practice, have left gaps that only combat can close, and combat closes them by blood. The Japanese Naval Air Service still fields fast aircraft with long range, and its doctrine prizes aggression. But today the American carriers are wrapped in an electronic fence and a human choreography that has tightened month by month since Guadalcanal. Plot lines crawl across the Lexington display. The first raid is detected at extreme range by SK radar. A picket destroyer confirms height with SC2, and the Combat Information Center begins to turn raw returns into a clockwork. Controllers assign altitude blocks to different combat air patrol divisions. A destroyer reports a bearing change. Another carrier Combat Information Center tracks a second group splitting low. The net is not a single hero with a perfect sight picture. It is a web of trained technicians and calm voices, guided by standard operating procedures, written during the long grind from the Southern Solomons to this place. At Angels 25, VF-16 slides into position above the raid. The radio is cool and clipped. Call signs are real. Vectors are short. The Thach weave remains a survival tool, but today the emphasis is on interception geometry and coordinated slashing attacks. When Vraciu picks up the first string of Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, he rolls in with sun advantage, bursts fire at range to walk the tracers, then commits. The Hellcat bleeds some speed but holds its line, and the first D-4Y breaks apart, smoke pouring. Vraciu will claim 6 that day, and gun camera film will show much of it. He is not alone. Above and abeam other sections carve into the formation, while lower blocks catch stragglers and lagging escorts. Radios stay mostly clear. The Combat Information Centers keep feeding vectors to fresh sections to replace shooters who have burned fuel or ammunition. Ships below are not spectators. Every carrier in Task Force 58 has a Combat Information Center, and each has trained to pass plots, deconflict interceptions, and time reliefs. Radar pickets extend the eyes outward. When a raid survives the fighter screen, the ships layer their defense, long-range anti-aircraft fire, then medium-range, then close in. But today, the goal is to stop most attackers far from the box. The arithmetic is brutal and honest. It rests on serviceable radios, a deep pool of trained pilots, reliable engines that do not cough at takeoff, and a maintenance system that turns sorties into more sorties tomorrow. It is less dramatic than a duel. It is more decisive than a duel. By late afternoon, the pattern is set. Waves rise on the boards and waves are erased. Some Japanese pilots get through and make their runs. Several bombs splash wide. A few hits land because war is never one-sided from every angle. Damage control teams move as if they have practiced every hour for 2 years because they have. On flight decks, ordnance crews rearm and refuel with practiced motion. The net holds. At Ozawa headquarters, the picture is stark. Losses are high, and many of the fallen were men whose logbooks held too few hours to give them the best chance. The sky has become a place where procedure defeats inspiration. The boards in the combat information centers fade to a dull glow as night routine returns, but the method that carried the day did not appear full-grown. It was built step by step from the southern Solomons onward. In the autumn of 1942, during the actions around Guadalcanal and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, United States Navy carriers learned hard lessons about early warning, fighter control, and deck cycle. Discipline. Radar gave range and bearing, but untrained voices could drown a net, and scattered sections could miss an intercept by minutes and miles. Pilots and controllers began to codify the simple things that saved lives: standard brevity, words, altitude blocks assigned before launch, 2-ship and 4-ship sections that stayed married, and the habit of trusting a controller's vector rather than the lure of a single target slipping away below. Names that now read like doctrine were then only experiments under stress. Commander John S. Thatcher's weave remained a close combat survival pattern, but its deeper contribution was cultural discipline under pressure, section work over the lone chase, and faith that another friendly section was positioned to catch what you let go. On USS Enterprise CV-6 and USS Saratoga CV-3, fighter directors and radar teams learned to translate raw echoes into timelines, and air group leaders learned to time deck spots so that fresh combat air patrol could take station before tired sections ran low on fuel. The Coast Watcher's reports around Guadalcanal stitched into the carrier picture, teaching a habit of fusing multiple imperfect sources rather than waiting for a perfect one that never arrived. Through 1943, as the Central Pacific Drive began, the choreography improved. Carriers of the Essex class brought larger decks, deeper magazines, and more radios that worked when wet and hot. Maintenance crews settled into a rhythm that turned sorties today into more sorties tomorrow. The combat information centers hardened into nerve centers, with assigned fighter director officers who spoke in calm, short vectors. Destroyer pickets with SC sets pushed the radar horizon outward. When the force massed as a task group, multiple combat information centers shared plots, so that a section launched from one ship could be handed across to a controller on another without confusion. The effect was incremental and unromantic, but each refinement shaved seconds off the climb to an intercept and reduced the waste that had once scattered fuel and ammunition into empty ocean. Across the water, the Japanese Naval Air Service bled away its instructors, test pilots, and group leaders in the same period. After the battles of 1942, the veteran base that had trained the pre-war force shrank. Fuel scarcity cut training hours. New pilots learned basic flight and gunnery, but had fewer chances to practice formation, blind approaches, and radio discipline. Aircraft that were fast and agile arrived with light protection and often unreliable radios. Courage did not vanish, but the muscle memory that lets a formation climb level and turn as one under a controller's voice could not be conjured in a briefing. The gap widened slowly at first, then faster. By the time 5th Fleet, under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance moved on the Marianas, the American method was a machine. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher's Task Force 58 could hold a large combat air patrol at multiple altitudes, recover it in a steady pattern, and push a fresh one up on schedule. The carriers were not only flight decks, they were data engines whose operators had rehearsed the handoffs until they felt ordinary. A section lead could accept a vector in 3 clipped words, check, fuel, and ammunition, with a glance, and know his wingman would be where he was supposed to be, without a second call. When the raid picture formed on the transparent boards, the controllers did not chase contacts. They placed blocks of fighters in the path and let geometry do the work. The ledger that day in the Western Pacific reflected all of this. Pilots like Lieutenant Alexander Vratiu from VF-16 on USS Lexington CV-16 cut into bomber streams and escorts with economy. Other squadrons across the task force did the same. Claims would be argued, as claims always are, but the shape of the fighting was plain even in the moment. Most attackers died far from the ships. Those who reached the outer ring found a second belt of guns. Those who survived that belt found damage control teams that treated fire and smoke as another drill. The contrast with the early Solomon's days could be felt on the catwalks and in the ready rooms. The net no longer sagged at the knots. Daylight slid off the sea. Far to the west, the Japanese mobile force counted losses and weighed what strength remained for another day. In the flag spaces of Task Force 50, 8 planners reviewed fuel states, ammunition, stocks, pilot hours, deck cycle timings, and the persistent question of whether to risk a long-range strike at dusk. The confidence was not bravado. It was the quiet belief of crews who had seen an idea become a dependable habit. Procedure had turned into advantage, and advantage had turned into survival. Night falls soft over the Marianas. On American decks, yellow wands guide the last aircraft to the wires, then to the bow. Ordnance crews stack belts and bombs. In the combat information centers, boards are wiped, then redrawn for the morning. What remains cannot be erased. The shape of the day, the feel of the method, the tally that is less about claims and more about the geometry that produced them. Across the horizon, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa keeps faith with duty and orders up fresh efforts for the next sun. His air groups are thinner, his veteran corps is thinner still. Dawn returns with a hard line on the eastern sky. The second day repeats the ritual long radar sweeps, destroyer confirmations, altitude blocks, and short, calm vectors. The fighter screen climbs levels and waits on headings that look abstract on the plot and become ambushes in the air. Sections from squadrons like VF-2 and VF-16 slide into the lanes, take measured shots, and break clean. When a raid leaks through, anti-aircraft layers meet it, and damage control teams treat fire as a known problem. The result is not luck. It is process. By late afternoon of the second day, the Philippine sea story has its spine. Japanese strike groups have been cut down at range. American carriers have absorbed blows without losing the tempo of launch and recovery. The difference flows from many small things that look minor in isolation. Serviceable radios under heat and salt, standard phrases that do not waste syllables, wingmen who do not vanish when tracers appear, and maintenance crews who convert. Night into airplanes that start on the first try. It is the same lesson learned from the Southern Solomons forward, now expressed at full scale. Far away in Tokyo, the German naval mission listens. Vice Admiral Paul Wenneker, the Kriegsmarine representative in Japan, has spent the war relaying material, technical notes and operational impressions to the Seekriegsleitung, the German naval staff. Reports now move along cables and couriers that say the same thing in different words. Veteran Japanese carrier pilots are scarce. Replacement pilots are undertrained. Radios fail too often. Coordination breaks under pressure. American carriers operate a radar-directed fighter defense that intercepts early and often. No fiction is needed. The contrast between expectation and outcome is plain. In Berlin, staff officers had long argued that American carrier aviation relied on numerical mass more than method. They respected individual American pilots, but doubted that a navy built on industry could also master fine fighter direction. The Marianas Ledger hits that belief hard. Radar plots that become disciplined vectoring, combat information centers that hand off sections between ships without confusion, pilots who stay in 2-ship and 4-ship discipline instead of chasing personal duels. The kill ratio skews because procedure multiplies every advantage and blunts every weakness. The numbers are not an accident. They are the visible edge of an invisible system. On the flag bridges of 5th Fleet and Task Force 58, the American reading is colder. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance keeps his operational frame tight. Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher and his group commanders review sorties, flown fuel, burned crews, rested engines due for change, and the pilot pool that must remain healthy for the next operation. The talk is about timings, deck cycles, and the decision points for a long-range strike that evening or a delayed blow at dawn. Pride exists, but it takes the form of confidence in drills that worked again. The men who live inside the machine know that today's success must be paid forward in maintenance hours and sleep. Back in Tokyo, Japanese officers who survived the day speak with the frankness of professionals. Courage is not in question, neither is will, but fuel scarcity has starved training. Radios do not carry reliably. Section tactics fracture when the first pass goes wrong. The crews who would have trained the next class died in earlier campaigns. Airframes that once ruled by agility carry thin armor and ignite easily under heavy caliber fire. The deficiencies are not moral, they are structural. The news that filters back to Berlin through the German mission crystallizes into a quiet admission in staff journals and internal notes. The American carrier fighter arm is not simply numerous. It is well directed, well maintained, and well supplied, and it is commanded by officers who trust radar and procedure. The derision fades because it cannot stand next to the Philippine Sea record. When German analysts lay the Marianas outcomes beside their own experiences with radar direction in the Atlantic and with ground-controlled interception over the Reich, they recognize the logic. Early warning tied to disciplined vectors changes the airfight before pilots see each other. The surprise is not that the ratios skew. The surprise is how relentlessly they stay skewed across hours and waves. Sunset washes the carriers in copper. On ready-room chalkboards, pilots write simple notes for the next launch: climb fast, hold block, brake by section, do not chase. In the plotting rooms, young sailors redraw the big circle around the task groups and mark bearings with slow, careful strokes. Everything looks ordinary again. That is the secret. Ordinary procedure became decisive power. In distant staff rooms that had derided the idea, the realization lands without ceremony. This is not a single day's anomaly, but a system that will repeat itself wherever the decks and the radar sets and the trained voices assemble. October arrives with hard blue skies over the Philippine Sea. Admiral William F. Halsey holds overall command as 3rd Fleet, while Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher drives Task Force 38, the fast carriers. The roster reads like a roll call of flight decks that learned their craft the hard way. USS Essex, CV-9, USS Enterprise, CV-6, USS Lexington, CV-16, USS Intrepid, CV-11, USS Franklin, CV-13, and more. On their islands, combat information centers hum the same drill practiced in the Marianas. On the Japanese side, Admiral Soemu Toyoda's headquarters directs the show plans that aim to defend the approaches to the Philippines with heavy land-based air from Formosa and Luzon and the remaining carrier air groups. 12 October to 15 October, the Formosa air battles. Dawn launches from Task Force 38 push fighter sweeps and strike groups toward airfields at Shinchiku, Tainan Heito, Matsuyama, and Takao. The first contacts are fast and confused, but the pattern settles quickly. Radar pickets extend the American eyes. Controllers assign altitude blocks. Sections of F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs hold discipline and cut in with short bursts. Japanese fighters come up with fire and courage, but many pilots have thin logbooks and unreliable radios. The kill ledger tilts again. Claims will vary by squadron and by day, but the shape is fixed radar-directed combat air patrol. Intercepts far from the carriers, then escorts that keep enemy fighters off the bombers, then anti-aircraft belts that finish what slips through. Damage comes back the other way, because war never writes single-column accounts. USS Canberra CA-70 and USS Houston CL-81 take torpedo hits from land-based aircraft during the 3rd week of October, and Task Group 34.5 forms as a temporary shield to cover their withdrawal. The incidents prove the rule rather than break it. When the method is bent by surprise or distance, the Americans restore it with massed fighters, steady anti-aircraft fire, and disciplined damage control. The crews speak in the same short words they used in June. Vectors, angels, fuel state, deck cycle. No one waits for a single duel to decide the day. Across the water, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepares its carrier bait plan for the larger Leyte operation. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa will bring a decoy force north. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita will drive the center force through the Sibuyan Sea and the San Bernardino Strait. On the American side, the fast carriers split into task groups under Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman, Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan, Rear Admiral Alfred E. Montgomery, and Rear Admiral John S. McCain, Sr. The air picture that develops over the Philippines in late October is crowded, layered, and unforgiving. Through it all, the carrier fighter arm behaves like a metronome. 24 October, the Sibuyan Sea. Radar nets and scouts report Kurita's battleships and cruisers. Strikes roll from multiple decks. Fighter direction keeps escorts tight to the bombers outbound and clears lanes for returning groups that are low on fuel. Japanese land-based air throws in raids against the carriers. The combat air patrol climbs early and meets them high. Radios work, sections hold together. When the first pass scatters a formation, friendly pairs reform without drama and re-enter on a vector rather than a hunch. The kill tally again leans toward the Americans because the geometry and the discipline favor the side that sets the terms of each merge. 25 October, the day of the many contacts. In the north, Ozawa's carriers draw Halsey and Task Force 38 toward Cape Engano. In the east of Samar escort carrier task units fight for their lives against Kurita's cruisers and battleships. The fast carriers keep flying, and their fighter directors keep the net intact over decks that launch, recover, and rearm in an unbroken loop. The contrast with early war practice is stark. In 1000 of 942, a single missed vector could peel a section away from the fleet for a full fuel load. In 1944, the carriers hand off sections between task groups, and the pilots trust the handoffs. German officers reading Tokyo dispatches and neutral press digests can follow the thread without guessing. The same features that produced the Philippine Sea results appear again in October. American carriers discover raids early with radar. Fighter directors vector combat air patrol with standard words and altitude blocks. Sections attack by plan and break clean to reform. Radios hold. Engines start. Deck crews keep the cycle intact. Damage control makes every hit a problem to be solved, rather than a crisis to be feared. Japanese pilots fight bravely, but undertrained wings, thin protection, and radio failures leave formations brittle after the first pass. The ratio tilts because the system tilts it. On the flag bridges, the American language stays sober. Admiral William F. Halsey weighs the pursuit north against the San Bernardino Strait, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher watches the flight, schedules the fuel states, and the condition of squadrons that must still be ready for the next month's work. The talk in ready rooms is practical. Keep the pairs tight. Take short bursts. Trust the controller. Do not chase into clouds alone. If you lose your wingman, climb 2,000 feet and turn to the last vector. The habits are simple, but they make a wall that does not show in a single photograph. When the October battles close, the arithmetic lines up with June's lesson. Japanese air strength around Formosa and the Philippines is thinner. Many experienced leaders are gone. Training pipelines cannot replace them at the needed pace or quality. Fuel scarcity bites every syllabus hour. Radios fail too often. The American side shows something that staff officers in Berlin had not expected from a navy they associated with mass production, a repeatable finesse in fighter direction that turns numbers into certainty and certainty into survival. The derision that once colored internal comments about American carrier fighters as merely numerous cannot stand next to days when early warning, vectoring, and disciplined sections turn most encounters before the first gun pass. Night falls over Leyte Gulf with thunderheads stacked on the horizon. On the islands of the fast carriers, young sailors wipe boards clean and begin again. The next day will bring more contacts. The method that beats those contacts is already written in the muscle memory of thousands of hands. April arrives with grey squalls over the Ryukyus. Fifth Fleet returns to its flag with Admiral Raymond A. Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher brings Task Force 58 forward to cover the Okinawa landings. The method that ruled in the Marianas and over Formosa is now asked to endure day after day. Radar picket destroyers push far ahead on numbered stations. Their SK and SC series air search sets right first warnings into the ether. On the big decks, combat information centers tighten the ritual that has become muscle memory altitude blocks assigned before launch. 2-ship and 4-ship sections, held tight, Short vectors in plain phrases, reliefs timed to the minute by deck cycles that do not slip when the rain hits. The enemy has changed shape but not courage. The Kikusui-massed attacks will come in waves, and many aircraft are flown on one-way orders. The wall must be longest where the raids begin. At dawn, on one early April day, controllers on USS Enterprise CV-6 and USS Bunker Hill CV-17 lift blocks of F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs to Angels 2-0 and Angels 3-0. Destroyers on the outer ring call first plots as faint returns, then stronger. Bearings are passed in flat voices. Vectors snap out left to heading 260 climb 1000 hold. The fighters level see sun flashes on wings and commit as sections, not as single hunters. Short bursts. Break by pairs. Reform. Accept the next vector. The pattern looks simple when written on a board. It is hard when done with fuel burning and tracers near the canopy. The pressure does not break the system. It tries. On April 16, the destroyer USS Laffey DD-724 holds off multiple attackers on her picket station and survives with wreckage on the deck and fires below. On May 11, USS Bunker Hill C V-17 takes 2 kamikaze hits in minutes, while her combat air patrol is turning relief, and the deck is crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. Damage control turns horror into survival, with hoses, jettisoned ordnance, and men who have rehearsed the steps until they can do them in smoke. The fighter direction net flexes routes returning sections to other decks and lifts replacements from carriers that still have clear lanes. The wall bows. It does not fall. Pilots write in ready room chalk the same short sentences they used in June and October. Trust the controller. Keep the pair. Do not chase into cloud. Climb to the last vector if separated. They land with holes in wings and empty belts, and launch again after the crews pull threads of metal from the flaps. Radios that work under salt and heat remain the quiet heroes. A section lead can call a vector and a fuel state in one breath, and know that a controller on a different ship will catch the handoff when he crosses a sector line. The vocabulary is small by design. The results are large because friction is kept small. Across the sea in Tokyo, the German naval mission continues to read Japanese situation reports and to forward extracts to Berlin. Vice Admiral Paul Wenneker's packets now include accounts of massed special attack waves being met far from the transport areas by radar-directed combat air patrol of destroyer pickets that act as early warning nodes and of carrier fighter, direction that remains coherent under hours of pressure. The Japanese officers who brief him do not hide the facts. Fuel scarcity has thinned training. Radios fail too often in heat and vibration. Formation discipline fractures after the first pass. Courage is present, but muscle memory is missing. The staff in Berlin do not need to invent conclusions. They can trace the same line from the Marianas to Formosa to Okinawa, early warning, calm vectoring section, discipline and maintenance that makes tomorrow possible. On the American side, the arithmetic is kept in ledgers that matter to survival. Sorties flown per day. Engines due for change per squadron. Hours logged per pilot since last stand down. The names on the boards are real. Task Group 58.1 under Rear Admiral Joseph J. Clark. Task Group 58.2 under Rear Admiral Gerald F. Bogan. Task Group 58.3 under Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman. Task Group 58.4 under Rear Admiral Ralph E. Davison. Each group carries its own combat information center culture, yet all speak the same grammar of vectors, angels, and handoffs. When weather closes, one sector, another picks up the burden. When a deck is fouled by damage, an adjacent carrier extends its cycle. The method survives contact because it has been taught to survive interruption. May slides into June. The picket stations keep paying in smoke and bravery. The carriers keep lifting and recovering. The fighter directors keep the net intact by refusing drama. Even in the worst hours when multiple raids appear and one ship burns, the voices on the net hold their shape. The kill ratios in air-to-air encounters remain lopsided wherever disciplined sections meet formations that cannot stay whole after the first pass. That is not triumphalism. It is geometry enforced by training, and by radios that carry, and by engines that start. In Berlin, the remaining naval air analysts place the Okinawa reports beside the Marianas ledger and the October diary pages. The pattern is painful to admit and impossible to ignore. The American carrier fighter arm is not merely numerous. It is directed, supplied, and maintained by a method that takes away chance. The staff notes turn quiet. Derision has no footing. When they think of their own experience with ground-controlled interception over the Reich, they recognize the bones of the same animal, early warning that sets terms, vectors that turn chaos into planned merges and discipline that outlives fear. The shock is not the existence of the method. The shock is the American ability to repeat it for months at sea. Twilight settles on the fleet. On the islands, young sailors erase boards and redraw altitudes for the dawn. In the ready rooms, pilots check goggles, drink coffee, and memorize simple plans. The wall will be needed again in the morning. It will be built again in the morning by the same hands, in the same words, at the same speeds. Procedure remains the hero the camera never quite sees. The Okinawa boards come down when the typhoons close the ocean. Pilots rotate to shore. Deck crews count spares and tools. The war's last weeks grind forward. Inside flag spaces, the ledgers that mattered during combat become the ledgers that will explain it, sorties per day. Serviceable aircraft at dawn, engines pulled before failure pilot hours, since carrier qualification radios passed or failed. After salt spray trials. None of these numbers look like romance. All of them look like causes. On Pacific bases, intelligence officers assemble captured papers, prisoner interrogations, and wreck surveys from beaches and paddies. Japanese squadron logs show the same cruel slope seen since the Marianas' heavy veteran losses in earlier campaigns, training syllabi shortened to push wings out faster, fewer formation flights and radio checks that pass on the ground, and fail at altitude. Aircraft that can climb and turn on paper arrive with thin protection and fuel systems that ignite under heavy caliber hits. Instructors who would have taught the hard parts are gone. New leaders are brave, but the habit of section discipline under a controller's voice cannot be improvised in a briefing. The gap between courage and choreography widens. American officers compare those files with their own method, as recorded, not as remembered. The contrast is plain. Fighter direction manuals have been reprinted and thumbed through since the Southern Solomons. Combat information centers are not glamorous, but they exist on every big deck, and their equipment lists are specific air search, radar height finders where available, repeater scopes, talkers drilled to a narrow vocabulary grease pencil, plotters trained to draw, erase, and redraw without guessing. Destroyer pickets extend the warning circle and hand plots inward. Controllers keep altitude blocks simple vectors short and handoffs firm. Deck cycles put fresh sections into the sky before tired ones drift below fuel minimums. Maintenance trades darkness for tomorrow's sorties and treats every preventable failure as a moral error. The language is dry. The outcome is bright lines on the boards where raids turn into falling dots before the ships are at risk. Across the world in ruined capitals, the analysis begins in quiet rooms. The German naval mission's files in Tokyo do not vanish with the last dispatch. Vice Admiral Paul Wenneker's habit of sending sober summaries leaves a trail that German staff officers read without illusions. In those pages, the theme never changes. Early warning, calm fighter, vectoring reliable radios, section discipline, and maintenance. Depth turn air-to-air combat into a controlled geometry that punishes formations which cannot stay whole after the first pass. The staff notes include an uncomfortable mirror. Ground-controlled interception over the Reich had already taught the German services the power of early warning tied to precise vectors. The surprise is not the method's existence. The surprise is the American Navy's ability to carry that method at sea for months across weather, across logistics, across fatigue, and to repeat it after damage and after loss without losing shape. The post-war accounting that follows is less about victory speeches than about institutional memory. In Washington, boards convene to codify what worked. Fighter direction remains a specialty with names and billets, not an improvisation. Carrier air groups write down the simple truths that carried them. Assign altitude blocks before launch. Keep the two-ship and four-ship marriages sacred. Speak in short words on the net. Hand off sections early rather than late. Time deck spots to fuel, not to hope. Aviation schools expand the hours for instrument flying for radar intercept procedures and for the art of staying with your wingman while trusting a controller's unseen hand. The lesson is not only for the Pacific, it is doctrine for any ocean where decks and radars can meet. In the Pacific Islands and on the Asian mainland, the wreckage tells its own story to men who have learned how to listen. Fighter gun cameras are reviewed frame by frame, not to gloat, but to measure. Many kills begin from altitude advantage granted by early warning and by patient geometry, not by lone chases. Burst lengths are short, sections break away by the book, and reform by the book. Pilots who survive the longest are those who preserve fuel and altitude discipline while keeping to the net's rhythm. The outliers exist as they always do, but they do not set the day's shape. The shape belongs to the machine. In the German notes, the tone shifts from derision to analysis. Remarks that once dismissed American carrier fighters as merely numerous give way to concrete observations about continuity of operations, about the integration of radar, radio, and fighter direction, and about the depth of the maintenance base that makes repetition possible. The phrase that appears more than once in internal summaries is quiet and exact. The ratios are systemic. It is an admission without theatre. It is also a map for any staff that hopes to avoid shock the next time it meets a fleet that treats procedure as a weapon. American officers who lived through the long months at sea are wary of turning the ledger into a tale of destiny. They know how close the wall came to breaking at times, how much depended on a pump that kept pressure on a talker who did not freeze on a young controller who kept his voice steady while the scope bloomed with returns. They remember the deck fires and the nights when the ocean looked ready to take the ship whole. Their pride is specific. It belongs to drills and to maintenance and to a language of short words tested in heat and smoke. The kill ratios are the visible edge of that invisible labor. By the first post-war year, the institutional memory hardens into training syllabi and into layouts for future combat information centers. The next generation of radars and radios arrives, but the grammar does not change. Early warning must be trusted. Vectors must be obeyed. Sections must stay married. Maintenance must buy tomorrow's sorties during tonight's darkness. The lesson does not promise easy victories. It promises a shape that, when kept, bends the ledger toward survival and toward advantage day after day. In a quiet archive, a clerk files a stack of translated mission reports from Tokyo under a plain title. The pages do not carry headlines. They carry a method seen by adversaries and measured in ledgers and recs. The men who once derided it have marked in the margins what they could not ignore. The camera never sees that moment. The staff rooms do. The shock is quiet, and it lasts. Summer fades on the western Pacific anchorages. Lines are coiled, decks are scraped, and air groups thin as men go home in waves. Inside offices that smell of paper and oil clerks stack ledgers beside after-action reports, gun camera reels, and intercepted dispatches. The story that those stacks tell is not a tale of single heroes or of single duels. It is a line that runs from the southern Solomons through the Marianas, Formosa, Leyte, and Okinawa. Early warning turned into calm vectors. Sections kept married. Radios that worked under heat and salt. Maintenance that bought tomorrow during tonight's darkness. Where that line held air-to-air exchanges, bent the ledger hard to the American side. Where it frayed, ships bled, and were saved by hands that had drilled the saving. In Tokyo, the rooms that once briefed hope now house officers who speak with the clarity that follows defeat. Their notes match what American intelligence has already laid out from wreck surveys and interrogations. Veteran losses that began in 1942 hollowed the Japanese Naval Air Service instructor base. Fuel scarcity shortened syllabi and robbed students of formation hours. Radios failed at the moment they were most needed. Airframes that were fast and agile on paper burned easily under heavy-caliber fire. None of this negates courage. All of it explains why a disciplined net could turn most merges before the first gun pass, and why formations could not stay whole after the first broken entry. In Berlin, the remaining naval and air staff officers read the last packets from the German mission in Japan and filed them under plain covers. Vice Admiral Paul Wenneker's reports, stripped of theatre, use a vocabulary that the staff recognizes from its own ground-controlled interception experience: early warning, vector integrity, altitude blocks, handoff discipline. The surprise that had colored earlier comments, the one that treated American carrier aviation as mass without method, has nowhere to stand. The internal phrasing that settles in the margins is measured, and exact. The ratios are systemic. The staff do not wrap the line in rhetoric. They accept the arithmetic because it repeats from sea to sea and month to month. Across the world, American boards convene with a different task. Their charge is to keep the parts that worked and to name them so clearly that no one can forget. Fighter direction billets are fixed as specialties, not improvisations. Combat Information Center layouts are drawn with required instruments and talker positions. Destroyer picket doctrine is written with ranges, rotations, and relief triggers. Training syllabi expand the hours for instrument, flying radar intercept procedures, section reform after the break, and fuel discipline under controller vectors. The short words that saved lives become print vectors: Angels block, handoff, fuel state, deck cycle. The next radars and the next radios will change in detail, but the grammar will not. The officers who have lived the months at sea add their caution to the ink. They refuse to let ledgers become destiny. They put down the near misses, the days when picket lines were punched through, when decks burned, when the net held by an inch because a young talker kept his voice steady or a controller trusted a faint return. Their insistence matters. It keeps the doctrine honest. It keeps the language short and hard instead of triumphant. It reminds the institution that procedure is power only when it is rehearsed to the point where weather loss and fear cannot break it. By the first post-war winter, the archives that matter are quiet rooms with metal shelves. Folders hold translated mission reports from Tokyo, American carrier fighter direction manuals with grease thumbprints, destroyer picket station logs with burned edges, and after-action letters from squadrons whose chalkboards still held. Simple rules. Stay with the pair, take short bursts, trust the vector, climb to the last heading. If separated, do not chase into cloud alone. A historian could read the whole thing forward or backward and reach the same conclusion. The kill ratios that tilted so sharply in 1944 and 1945 were not a quirk of any single battle. They were the visible edge of an invisible system that made ordinary actions decisive by making them repeatable. The German staffs that once derided that possibility closed their files without public drama. The admission remains in pencil on working papers where truth often lives. The American officers who built the machine turn to peacetime with the knowledge that the ocean will test them again in some new shape. They leave behind a method that can meet that shape: find early, speak plainly, place sections by plan, keep radios honest, buy tomorrow's sorties with tonight's hands. It is not a promise of easy days. It is a promise of a wall that can be rebuilt wherever decks, radars, and trained voices gather. On a last afternoon before reassignment, a controller walks the island passage of a carrier that has finally gone quiet. He runs his fingers across the edge of the plotting table, where the grease pencil stained the metal a permanent grey. He looks once at the repeater scope that carried faint echoes from far beyond the horizon. Then he turns off the lights. Outside, the sea is flat and bright. Inside the file rooms, the system that turned brightness into survival waits in paper and in memory, ready to be taught again.